Peace and justice are crucial to a stable world. To this end, strong institutions and partnerships, for instance between major organizations and government bodies, ensure that we can all work together for a thrivable future. That's why we've invited 3 experts on these fields to discuss how we can guide sustainable policies that guide us all to a peaceful and prosperous world for everyone. They are Dr. Richard Denton, who has been associated with numerous organizations, including the Rotary Action Group for Peace and International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Shubhi Goel, a freelance consultant specializing in climate policy and carbon markets, and Alyn Ware, the Program Director of the World Federalist Movement. After their presentations, they kindly took questions from the audience.
Before jumping on to the Q&A session, I'd like to thank our speakers again for sharing their valuable knowledge and experience with us. And I always say, with step by step and drop by drop, we will certainly make a big change for a thrivable future. With that, we move on to the first question, which is open to our speakers, and anyone can answer first. So my question is, what lessons can be learned from countries that have successfully aligned their policies with SDG 16 and 17? To support your views, you can cite an example from your domain of expertise. Anyone can answer first. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And this is a really important question because the Sustainable Development Goals are sort of the ration d'etre of the United Nations. It was a really important initiative to build some consistency and coherence between the different parts of the United Nations and what it's working towards. We know that not all the Sustainable Development Goals have been achieved, and there's a lot more work to be done. And part of that is to ensure that countries bring their policies in line with the Sustainable Development Goals in order to build their implementation. I would say in our research for the World Future Policy Awards this year, the policy we came across that I think was the strongest in integrating the Sustainable Development Goals into national legislation commitments and implementation is the Wales Wellbeing of Future Generations Act of 2015. It brings the Sustainable Development Goals as the goals to be achieved for this act. It provides a commissioner, it establishes a position of a commissioner for future generations who has a role of overseeing the implementation. It requires all of the government departments to subscribe to those goals, to the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular, because it's looking at the well-being of future generations, to have reports and analysis on how their policies will impact on future generations. And if it's not positive, then they have to change the policies. It also applies to the corporate sector. If the corporate sector is having any contracts with the Wales government, they also have to adhere to the Wales Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I think that's a really good model. It's one of the reasons why it was one of the winners, one of the 4 winners of the World Future Policy Awards this year. I showed the From Arms to Farms program as the video, but I'll put in the chat the video, Wales Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, for you to be inspired by that. Thank you.
Richard, would you like to have a go?
Again, I just wanted to thank my colleague, Alyn, for covering much of the same territory that I have covered and to working on a commonist security. One of the other areas that I'm working with is with a colleague, Ernest Thiessen, who has developed a computer program called Smart Settle, which is based on the work of John Nash, who was the Nobel laureate in economics and produced a film called Beautiful Mind, which really doesn't go into that very much. But it is a program where various parties can come together, put in their weighted requests anonymously, and the computer then puts out a solution or possible solutions that are better than the status quo. And so this is another technique that I find can be useful in settling disputes diplomatically. And therefore, I think will go a long way to helping the United Nations and other organizations like the ICJ in preventing problems and settling disputes.
Thank you for your view. Shubhi?
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Alyn. So I'll talk about Article 6 or maybe carbon markets specifically when we talk about SDG 16 and 17. Have seen since long that SDGs are there from very long time, but the individual participations through projects that was not being considered. So when we talk about top-down approach and bottom-up approach, these both are come together through carbon market mechanisms. And since together they are coming into picture, top-down approach has coming up through the policy frameworks and the integrity of the frameworks that should be there. That was actually coming through the SDGs part as well. However, if we talk specifically about all the sustainable development goals that are there, it should have been aligned with the bottom-up approach, that what is happening in the ground. So what's unique in the carbon market is that each project that we actually align to or work for, or maybe the technology that we are talking about, it should talk uniquely about that particular project and is coming up from the bottom up and aligning to the policies that has been framed already through the top down approach. So aligning these two, I think this is ensuring the justice that majorly talks about the peace and the uniting everyone together, which talks about SDG 16 specifically, and also allowing each of the partnerships, not just at the top level or through bilateral and multilateral relations. That was the major talks or the topic that I discussed today. But it also allows stakeholder consultations at ground level. It also allows partnership at the ground level for actually implementing and making that particular project a success. So climate change, when we majorly talk about, is the role to ensure how sustainable development can be achieved for the peace that we are talking about. And that peace can come if both bottom up and top down can come together and we can lead or do or solve the problem for climate action. So that's my take, and all the projects that has been undertaken under carbon markets are unique in itself to actually achieve the peace within and for at the world as well.
Thank you, Shubhi. Thank you for sharing your views and thoughts on that. Now I'll ask specific questions to our speakers. I'll ask first specific question to Richard. You quoted Nelson Mandela in your presentation. May I also quote one of his sayings? That is, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Now, my question to you is, what can be done in making sure to educate the young minds about the wars and the people who have created it without being biased? For example, without any influenced one-sided view or ideological perspective. Your thoughts on this, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. It's a perfect question and very important. And I think, again, this is where you as individuals can work within your own community to do just that. I work with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Canada, and we are working on programs to educate in primary schools and to do just that. Another area that I find is very useful is the use of films. A film can get a story in 90 minutes that a whole classroom can see, and then they can discuss it afterwards. And one example of that is a Generation X person, Kasha Sequoia, is producing a film called, it's through Project SunPower, I think it is. It looks at bringing, doing interviews with people in their 20s about the connection between peace and war, between how the military is taking money away from looking at peace and the environment from Shubhi's point of view. And over 90 minutes, it gives lots of examples, and then discussion can follow after that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Richard. I'll come to Shubhi. So my question to you is, you talked about the Indian initiatives under the Article 6.2 mechanism. Could you highlight on any of these initiatives that you showed on your PPT that could serve as examples for the rest of the world?
Yeah, sure. So, India is at a very niche stage to do any partnerships currently. As I was mentioning, that even though Article 6.2 is quick and is more effective, why? Because we can have our own agreements. We have come up, or sorry, India has actually come up with 14 different activities. And those 14 activities talks about mitigation activities only, where they are ready to transfer the technology. So it would be very difficult to talk about any specific technology currently. Why? Because we haven't signed any agreement with any of the country. We are still in the discussion phase with Korea, South Korea majorly, Japan, as well as Singapore. And the con that I was mentioning, that though we are aligned or allowed to make our own agreements, but the negotiations might take longer than expected. Similarly, is happening with Indian a counterpart as well. There are a lot of political views that has considered and has been considered, which I saw is one of the question as well. Like how will actually decide that how much ITMOs that needs to be taken care by Indian climate actions or objectives to be achieved, and how much should be transferred. So we are unable to actually decide that if we want 80% of it and are only transferring 20% to, for example, say Singapore, they are not ready to transfer their technology at that particular stage. So these certain experiences, consultations that is coming into place from last 6 to 7 months now, we are unable to sign any agreements currently. So to have these framework in place, this needs to speed up. We shall have our own carbon pricing scheme for each of the technology that has defined. And depending on those carbon pricing, we should ensure or promise how much we are ready to actually transfer. That will actually speed up the process and the negotiations that are there currently. And since currently in Azerbaijan as well, we have come up with a proper framework of Article 6. So that can also lead to speed up, but it won't be a good idea to actually share a particular technology example right now because it's still in the formation stage. But I hope that helped you understand the current state of India.
Yeah, I completely understand that, and thank you for sharing those views. Now I'll move on to Alyn. You mentioned a point when talking about the Law Not War campaign, that is, increase the number of states accepting the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. I want to understand here, if that starts happening, how important will be diplomacy and negotiation alongside with a law which is designed to stop a war? There is a famous metaphor, settle outside the court. Will it still be important if everything is dragged to ICJ for settlement? Your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, and thank you so much. Just before I answer that, I'll also address the earlier question you had about the importance of education for peace and conflict resolution, because my first career was as a peace educator. So I was involved in setting up the peace education program in New Zealand. We got the peace studies guidelines adopted by the Ministry of Education, and my organisation, the New Zealand Foundation for Peace Studies, is under contract by the New Zealand government to help implement peace studies in the schools. And we have very successful programs, including peer mediation programs, where we have pupils from as young as 5 and 6 year olds being trained to be able to mediate conflicts with their peers and doing very, very well, all the way up through to the high school students. So I'll put that link in the chat. And also with the World Future Policy Awards, we were looking at some of these peace education programs, and 2 made the finalists. The Rwanda Peace Education Program, which has done incredibly in rebuilding the community following the genocide there and helping to overcome the divisions between the ethnic divisions there. And the Philippines one from Executive Order 570 from the former president of the Philippines, when she was the president, which has got directive from the top that's working with the Teachers College in the Philippines to get peace education through. So there's some really good models there of building peace education that I just want to identify in the chat. Now coming through to your question on the interplay between diplomacy, conciliation, and international law. And I say that interplay because it is an interplay. One can't work very well without the other. If you only rely on diplomacy, but you don't have the stronger version of this, which is the rule of law, then it's very easy for the most powerful countries just to ignore the needs of the least powerful countries, and it's the law of force. So diplomacy without the law is weak. On the other side, law without diplomacy is a little silly because the whole idea of law is to help resolve conflicts and ensure fairness. So that includes the mix. And the law comes in with sort of like, in a sense, the framework for being able to do that. Often when a case starts in court between disputing parties, what happens is that the parties then have to bring to the court all the background, all the facts. And once they start exploring all these facts, you then start applying the law. Quite often a diplomatic solution arises out of that. This is whether it's a domestic court or the international court. And the parties, seeing the better fact set, shift their approach from just adversarial to more the common security. How can we resolve this conflict based on having a better understanding of the facts from all sides? So often, a legal process can then move back into a diplomatic process. Secondly, when you have a decision from the court, there's also diplomacy required after that for the implementation. It's not just a case of sort of like a big stick coming down, this is what you have to do. The court often provides a nuanced opinion, which is providing obligations for both sides. A good example is Costa Rica versus Nicaragua. When Nicaragua occupied the San Juan Island in between the two countries, with their troops, Costa Rica took the case to the court. They didn't want to have a war with Nicaragua. So they took the case to the court. The court said, Nicaragua, you can't occupy an island. On the other hand, they had a genuine concern because Costa Rica was doing development along the San Juan River that was impacting on Nicaragua's rights. So the court came down with obligations for both sides. Nicaragua, get your troops off the island and accept that it's Costa Ricans. But Costa Rica and Nicaragua, when you're doing development, along the San Juan River, whether it's on the territories or in the river itself, you have to do environmental impact reports that you present to the other country. You have to involve in consultations with them. So we see there's an interplay between a judicial legal approach and a diplomatic approach. They reinforce each other.
Thank you, Alyn. Thank you. And thank you for answering the education part as well, like your thoughts. Now, I'll squeeze in a couple of questions from the viewers. First is from Ruth from Zambia. I think this one is directed more to Alyn and Dr. Richard. So the question is, are current geopolitical tensions increasing the likelihood of nuclear weapon deployment? And what lessons can we learn from historical nuclear standoffs to mitigate this?
Yes, I think, again, an excellent question to the questioner. Certainly, what we have found in our experience is that it's the opposite of, if you want peace, prepare for war. That actually leads to war. And when you are having nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert, then the risk of accidents and miscalculations can happen. When you are modernizing and spending a lot of money on nuclear weapons, again, there's that tendency to want to use them. We now have, quote, smaller, what's called tactical nuclear weapons, smaller size. And the idea is therefore to use them. And this is what Putin is now threatening. And of course, once that happens, then you will very quickly get an escalation to using larger nuclear weapons aimed at cities, aimed at civilians. So the tension is certainly increasing. And I think that nuclear weapons are now becoming obsolete. There's the old adage, you can't put the genie back into the bottle, but you can make them obsolete by newer technologies. And what we're seeing now with drones, it has completely changed the military in terms of both conventional. You can now have a drone come over and drop a bomb on a tank. So a $3,000 drone could take out a $12 million tank very easily. And we're now seeing what's happened in the Middle East. Drones are able to find their terrorist targets and take out terrorist leaders. And nuclear weapons are not useful anymore because they're not aimed at military targets, they're aimed at cities and civilians. So I think this is where the change is coming, and why, again, we need to simply get rid of nuclear weapons because of the risk of accidents and miscalculations. Alyn.
Yeah, thanks. So we have seen the rising risk of nuclear war by accident or miscalculation or crisis escalation in a number of geostrategic environments. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has come with additional threats, from Russia about the use of nuclear weapons. If the West responds to protect Ukraine or supports Ukraine with long-range missiles or various others. So there is a diplomatic approach that is required to ensure that this conflict doesn't flip over into a nuclear war. And I think, the response, particularly of the United States, is important here, because that's really, the one that holds the key here. The NATO weapons won't be used without US permission. Russia's really looking, a lot at the US. So playing a diplomatic response to this is very, very important. And I think, that the Biden administration was doing this very well. These threats did not end up with the crisis be escalating into nuclear war, nor did the West accept the coercion from Russia and stop supporting Ukraine. And Ukraine should be supported because they're being invaded. It's an act of aggression by Russia, as determined by the United Nations. So in this situation, there is the diplomacy, there's ensuring that there is an open channel to the nuclear armed states talking with each other, even if they disagree with each other's actions and are opposing each other on certain things. They have to keep the door to communication open to make sure that an incident doesn't get misread and lead to a nuclear war by miscalculation, for example. Secondly, we need to push further on policies that will reduce the possibility of a quick move towards nuclear weapons use. So that means, for example, adopting no first use policies, taking all of the weapons off high-level operational level to be used. That's important. I think, in the context of these armed conflicts, calling for unilateral elimination of nuclear weapons by either of the sides isn't going to work. Russia's not going to give up some nuclear weapons tomorrow. The United States won't give up its nuclear weapons while Russia has them. Many in Europe and the NATO countries go, perhaps we need nuclear deterrence, because look what happened to Ukraine. They gave up their nuclear weapons and got invaded by Russia. And so maybe we need the nuclear deterrence. So until we can provide a confidence in security without relying on nuclear deterrence, that policy will remain. That's why I mentioned common security is really, really important, building up the use of the International Court of Justice and diplomacy. I don't think we'll unilaterally get rid of nuclear weapons without that. So the combination of nuclear risk reduction and helping to resolve these conflicts is really, really important.
Yeah, I just want to highlight again the importance of communication. Back in the 60s, it was the red phone between the two countries where the leaders could speak to each other. It is not a good idea to close down embassies, because that, again, is another venue for communication. And I think with deterrence is that that is a failed concept, because Ukraine nuclear missiles were under the control of the Soviets back in the day and under control of Russia. So yes, they had nuclear weapons on their soil, but they weren't under the control of Ukraine, so they wouldn't have been a deterrent. And nuclear weapons deterrence, for it to work, it needs to be an immediate response, and an immediate response is suicidal for civilization. So it's a failed concept, and we need to recognize that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. Thank you, Alyn, for answering this question. So there is a question from Vidhi from India. She asked that how can cooperative mechanism under Article 6 can be leveraged to promote SDG 16 and 17 for tackling pressing social and economic challenges?
So specifically, if I'll talk about 16, Article 6, and I have this answer very quickly because I know we are running short with time. So for specifically 16, it is leveraging all the countries as well as UNFCCC to have a proper framework in both Article 6.2, 6.4 agreements. And that is majorly leading to acquiring the SDG 16 at place. And talking specifically about 17, I have talked a lot about how different partnership will help in leading to climate actions. And together, if we are able to have a framework in place and able to do such partnerships together through the agreements that will be formed, it will not only lead to economic viability, but it will also have other aspects in mind. For example, other sustainable development goals, because it completely depends on the kind of project we are into and how we are achieving into. So we are not only transferring the finance that is there, but also the technologies, also the energy. If we are talk about within the technology, that energy is enhancing a lot of other aspects. Clean cooking project itself is enhancing other 7 SDG goals. So the different kind of projects and the technologies that will be actually transferred will lead to all the aspects of economic finance and achieving all these policies within SDG 16 and 70, and also the other aspects of it. So that's the quick take on that particular question, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Shubhi. Thank you for answering that. As it's been highlighted that we are running short of time, and this restricts me to ask any further questions. I was enjoying. I'm certainly sure this audience were also enjoying this Q&A session. But I would request our speakers to answer the remaining questions offline. And for our viewers, do sign up our newsletter to get access to these Q&A and latest updates. Do sign up for our next webinar, which is on 21st of January 2025. It's themed on SDG 4 and 5, quality education, decent work, and economic growth and discoveries. Thank you.